The man who built a nation lost more battles than he won. Let that sink in for a second. The commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the father of the United States, the face on the $1 bill. This man suffered defeat after crushing defeat on the battlefield. He watched his soldiers starve, freeze, desert, and die. He made mistakes that military historians still shake their heads at. He surrendered a fort. He got outmaneuvered by the British so badly that his entire army nearly ceased to exist not once, not twice, but at least 3 separate times. And yet, he won. How does that happen? How does a man who loses so consistently end up winning the most consequential war in American history? That is the question that nobody really wants to answer honestly, because the honest answer is complicated. It messes with the legend. It forces you to look at George Washington not as a marble statue, but as a flesh and blood human being who made terrible decisions, got incredibly lucky, and somehow, through a combination of stubbornness, political genius, and sheer audacity, held everything together when literally everyone else wanted to quit. Today we are going to look at the real Washington, the one your textbook glossed over, the one who trembled, doubted, and stumbled. And by the end of this, you are going to see something remarkable, something that changes how you think about leadership, luck, and what it actually takes to win a revolution. Because here is the thing about George Washington that most people never stop to consider. He did not win the American Revolution by being the greatest battlefield commander in history. He was not a tactical genius in the tradition of Napoleon or Julius Caesar. He did not win by outsmarting the British generals at every turn. He won by surviving, by keeping the Continental Army alive just long enough for circumstances to shift in his favor. And the more you dig into the actual record, the more you realize that the line between genius and luck is razor thin, and Washington walked that line every single day for 8 years. So let us start at the beginning. Not the glorious beginning, the embarrassing one. The year is 1754. George Washington is 22 years old. He is young, ambitious, tall, 6 feet 2 inches in an era when the average man stands about 5 feet 7, with reddish-brown hair, broad shoulders, and the kind of physical presence that makes people instinctively look at him when he walks into a room. He has already shown personal courage under fire. He already carries himself like a man who believes he is destined for something. And he is absolutely certain that he knows what he is doing when he leads a small force of Virginia militia into the Ohio Valley to assert British territorial claims against the French. He is certain. He is also catastrophically wrong. Washington's first real military operation ends in humiliation. He ambushes a small French scouting party at Jumonville Glen, killing 10 men, including the French commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. It is a bold move. Maybe too bold. Because what Washington does not fully appreciate in that moment is that he has just fired shots that will echo across 2 continents and trigger what Europeans will call the 7 Years' War, the first truly global conflict in human history. One young officer, one hasty decision, and suddenly France and Britain are at each other's throats, from India to the Caribbean. Did Washington understand what he had started? Almost certainly not. He was 22 years old and hungry for glory. What happened next was considerably less glorious. After the Jumonville ambush, Washington retreats and hastily constructs a small stockade in a meadow, a place he names, with unintentional irony, Fort Necessity. It is built in the worst possible location. It sits in a hollow, surrounded on 3 sides by wooded high ground. Any military engineer worth his salt would look at that position and wince. When a much larger French force arrives on July 3, 1754, they simply take the high ground, position their riflemen in the tree line, and begin shooting down into the fort at their leisure. Washington's men are trapped in a muddy depression, taking fire from all directions in pouring rain with no ability to effectively return fire. The battle lasts 9 hours. By the end, a third of Washington's force is dead or wounded. He is forced to sign a formal surrender document, a document that, thanks to a translation dispute, may have accidentally included Washington's admission that he had assassinated Jumonville rather than engaged him in combat. Washington always insisted he did not understand what he was signing. Whether that is true or not, the damage was done. So here is your first data point on the genius versus lucky question. Washington's very first independent military command ended with a surrender, a diplomatic incident, and a document that humiliated the British crown. Not exactly the opening chapter of a legend. But here is what is interesting. Washington did not disappear after Fort Necessity. He came back. He processed what had happened. He learned from it, or at least some of it, and he kept pursuing military service with the same relentless drive. The following year, 1755, he attached himself as a volunteer aide to British General Edward Braddock for the campaign against Fort Duquesne. And what happened during that campaign would become one of the most celebrated episodes of Washington's early career. Not because it went well, because it went spectacularly badly, and Washington somehow walked away from it alive when almost nobody else did. General Edward Braddock was a professional British officer of the old school, experienced, disciplined, contemptuous of colonial troops and frontier warfare. He marched an army of nearly 1,400 men through the Virginia wilderness toward Fort Duquesne with the kind of confidence that comes from having spent your entire career fighting in Europe, where armies march in formation on open ground and the rules are understood by everyone. The wilderness of western Pennsylvania was not Europe. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's column was ambushed by a combined force of French regulars and Native American warriors near the Monongahela River. The British formation collapsed almost immediately. Officers were shot from trees. Men who had never faced this kind of warfare panicked. The disciplined European tactics that made Braddock's army so formidable on a conventional battlefield became a death trap in the forest. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Out of his roughly 86 officers, 63 were killed or wounded. The slaughter was almost incomprehensible. And Washington? Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him. He had 4 bullet holes in his coat. He was sick with dysentery and riding in a wagon when the battle started. He mounted up despite his illness and rode into the chaos, trying to rally the fleeing troops. He was everywhere, and he survived without a scratch on his body. When he wrote to his family afterward, Washington himself marveled at what he called the miraculous care of Providence that protected him. He was not being falsely modest. He genuinely seemed to believe that something supernatural had kept him alive that day. And given the casualty rate around him, it is hard to argue with the sentiment. But let us hold that thought. Providence, luck, divine protection, because we are going to come back to it again and again throughout this story. After the Braddock disaster, Washington's colonial reputation actually grew. He had behaved heroically in a catastrophe. He had tried to bring order to chaos. He had survived when everyone around him died. The Virginia Assembly applauded him. People talked about him as a young man of destiny. And Washington absorbed all of this. He internalized the idea that he was someone special, someone protected, someone with a purpose. That belief, call it confidence, call it arrogance, call it faith, would sustain him through things that broke lesser men. But it would also sometimes lead him to take risks that no rational commander should take. The Washington of 1755 was being shaped into the Washington of 1776, and the lessons he was learning were not always the right ones. For the next 20 years, Washington retreated from active military life. He married Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759, a wealthy widow, practical and warm, who grounded him in ways that the battlefield never did. He managed his plantation at Mount Vernon, became a Virginia legislator, learned to navigate the subtle currents of colonial politics, and grew increasingly frustrated with British imperial policies. By the 1770s, he was one of the most respected men in Virginia, not just for his military service, but for his integrity, his judgment, his visible commitment to the community he lived in. When the crisis with Britain finally boiled over and the Continental Congress needed to appoint a commander-in-chief for the newly formed Continental Army in June of 1775, Washington was the obvious choice. Almost everyone agreed on that. What almost nobody agreed on was whether he was actually capable of fighting and winning a full-scale war against the most powerful military in the world. The Continental Army that Washington took command of in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the summer of 1775 was not really an army. It was a collection of militias from different colonies, each with its own culture, its own sense of loyalty, and its own ideas about discipline. The men were brave enough. Many of them were experienced hunters and woodsmen, comfortable with firearms in a way that impressed European observers, but they had almost no training in conventional military maneuvers. They elected their own officers in some cases. They went home when their enlistments ran out, regardless of what was happening in the field. They were chronically short of ammunition, food, clothing, and medicine. And they were facing the British Army, a professional force with centuries of tradition, superbly trained officers, and the resources of the most powerful empire on earth behind it. Washington spent the first months of the war doing something that history books rarely give him credit for. He did not fight. He besieged Boston. He sat there, just outside the city, and stared at the British across a fortified line while desperately trying to turn his mob of volunteers into something resembling a fighting force. He drilled them. He court-martialed officers who showed cowardice or corruption. He wrote frantic letters to Congress begging for supplies, for money, for longer enlistment terms. He threatened to resign at least once when Congress seemed unable to grasp the urgency of the situation. And in March of 1776, he made a move that was bold enough to be either brilliant or insane. He had his men drag dozens of captured British cannons up to Dorchester Heights overnight, creating a commanding position that suddenly made Boston untenable for the British garrison. The British left without a fight. Washington had his first victory. The country went wild with celebration. And that is where the story gets really dangerous. Because that victory convinced a lot of people, and maybe Washington himself at least a little, that perhaps this was going to be easier than anyone thought. The British had backed down. The army had held together. Maybe Providence really was on their side. Maybe the cause was so righteous that righteousness would be enough. The summer of 1776 was about to deliver a brutally different lesson. The British were not running. They were regrouping. And they were coming back with a force so overwhelming that when Washington finally sought assembling off Staten Island, he reportedly turned to his officers and said something that sounded much less like a general and much more like a man who had just understood, for the first time, exactly how much trouble they were in. General William Howe arrived off New York in the summer of 1776 with a force that dwarfed anything Washington could field. 32,000 British and Hessian soldiers, professional, experienced, magnificently equipped. Supporting them was the Royal Navy, the largest fleet in the world. Washington had perhaps 19,000 men, many of them raw recruits who had never seen combat. He had no navy at all, and he had to defend New York. Congress expected it. Public morale required it. The symbolic importance of the city was enormous. Washington knew it was probably a mistake to try. He wrote privately that he doubted the city could be held, but he tried anyway. And what followed was one of the most comprehensive military disasters in American history, and simultaneously one of the most miraculous escapes. The Battle of Long Island, fought on August 27, 1776, was a catastrophe for the Americans. Howe outflanked Washington's left completely, sending a force of 10,000 men through the Jamaica Pass, a route that Washington had left virtually unguarded because he had only 5 cavalry pickets watching it, and they were easily captured before they could give warning. The British fell on the American rear, or the Hessians attacked the front. The result was a rout. Hundreds of Americans were killed or captured, including 2 generals. The survivors retreated to fortified positions on Brooklyn Heights, with the East River behind them and the entire British army in front of them. Howe had them trapped. It seemed like the war might end right there, in late August, barely a year after it had started. But Howe did not press the attack. This is one of the great mysteries of the entire revolution. He had Washington cornered, his men outnumbered the Americans, his position was superior in every way, and he chose to begin formal siege operations instead of assaulting immediately. Why? Historians have debated this for 2.5 centuries. Some think he wanted to avoid the enormous casualties that a frontal assault would have produced. Some think he genuinely believed the rebels would negotiate and wanted to preserve that possibility. Some think he was simply overly cautious by temperament. Whatever the reason, his delay gave Washington 2 days. 2 days that changed everything. On the night of August 29, 1776, Washington made a decision that even his harshest critics acknowledge was brilliant in its execution. He evacuated his entire army across the East River in complete silence. Thousands of men, horses, artillery, supplies, all moved by boat in the dark under the noses of the British. Fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts, led by Colonel John Glover, handled the boats with such skill that the operation ran through the night without detection. A morning fog rolled in just as dawn was approaching, hiding the last boats from view. When the British finally realized what had happened, Washington's army had vanished. The entire force, 9,000 men, had escaped without losing a single soldier in the crossing. Howe was left staring at an empty fortification. Now ask yourself honestly, was that genius, or was it luck? The answer is both, and the proportions matter. Washington made the right call to evacuate. That was absolutely the correct strategic decision, and credit to him for making it. The execution by Glover's fishermen was skilled and professional, real competence under pressure. But the fog that descended at exactly the right moment and hid the last boats, just as daylight threatened to expose them. Washington himself later wrote that he believed it was an act of providence. And while a secular historian might attribute it to the weather patterns typical of late August in New York Harbor, the timing was extraordinary. This is a pattern you are going to see over and over throughout Washington's career. He makes a good decision. His men execute it with courage and skill. And then something, weather, enemy hesitation, a miscommunication on the other side, intervenes at precisely the right moment to save him from the consequences of his earlier mistakes. After the Long Island escape, the situation only got worse before it got better. Through September and October of 1776, Howe drove Washington's army steadily up Manhattan and into New Jersey. The Americans lost Fort Washington on November 16th, 2,800 men captured, one of the single worst American defeats of the entire war. Washington had kept the garrison there too long, despite warnings that it was indefensible. After the fall, his aide, Nathaniel Greene, who had pushed for holding the fort, wept openly. Washington himself was reportedly speechless. Then Fort Lee fell. Then the army began to dissolve as men deserted, went home when their enlistments expired, or simply stopped showing up. By December of 1776, Washington's force had shrunk to perhaps 3,000 men, ragged, freezing, dispirited men retreating across New Jersey with the British right behind them. Thomas Paine was there for part of that retreat, and he wrote about it in a way that captures the feeling of those days better than any official document. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country." He was not speaking in abstractions. He was describing men he had watched walk away in the cold New Jersey mud, men who had decided that the revolution was probably lost and their family farms mattered more than a cause that seemed to be dying. Washington read Paine's words and immediately ordered them read aloud to the troops. He understood the power of narrative. He understood that an army fights not just on food and ammunition, but on belief. And he understood that if something did not change very soon, Belief was going to be the first thing to run out. What Washington did next is the moment that most historians point to as the true hinge of the revolution. Not a great tactical victory, not a political masterstroke, a gamble, a cold, desperate, borderline suicidal gamble that should not have worked, and somehow did. On the night of December 25th, 1776, Christmas night, Washington loaded his remaining army into boats on the Delaware River and crossed back into New Jersey through a storm of sleet and ice. The crossing itself was brutal. The river was choked with ice floes. Men stood in the boats, soaking wet, in temperatures near freezing. Henry Knox, the massive, enormously competent artillerist who had dragged the Dorchester Heights cannons, managed the crossing with his usual impossible efficiency. By 4 in the morning, the army was across. They marched 9 miles through the storm to Trenton, where a force of Hessian soldiers was encamped. The Hessians, German mercenaries fighting for the British, were supposedly celebrating Christmas. The legend says they were drunk. The reality is more nuanced. Most evidence suggests the Hessians were not as unprepared as the mythology implies, and their commander, Johann Rall, was actually a capable officer who had defeated the Americans in previous engagements. But Washington caught them at a moment of disadvantage, attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, and, in a fight that lasted less than an hour, captured 900 Hessians while suffering only 4 American casualties, 2 of whom froze to death on the march rather than dying in combat. It was not a strategically decisive battle in the traditional sense. It did not break the British army, but it changed everything. The effect on morale on both sides was electric. Word spread through the colonies that Washington had struck back, that the army was still fighting, that the cause was not dead. Enlistments began to come in, money began to flow. Congress, which had been debating whether to negotiate with the British, stiffened its spine. And 10 days after Trenton, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating a British rear guard in a fight where he personally rode toward the enemy line on his white horse, close enough that officers covering their eyes expected to see him shot from the saddle. He was not touched. The British retreated. Washington had won 2 battles in 10 days, gone from the edge of extinction to the man of the hour. The narrative had flipped entirely. And that ability to flip the narrative, to turn a moment of apparent defeat into a story of resilience, was perhaps Washington's single greatest talent. But here is what the Trenton-Princeton story obscures if you're not careful. Washington's army crossed the Delaware on Christmas night in a snowstorm, achieved total surprise against a professional force, and suffered almost no casualties. That sounds like genius, and tactically, it was a well-planned, well-executed operation. But consider how many things had to go right simultaneously for it to work. The storm that made the crossing so brutal also concealed the movement from British patrols. The Hessians, despite not being drunk, were still in a slightly relaxed posture because they had received faulty intelligence suggesting no American attack was imminent. 2 other planned American crossings of the Delaware that night failed completely due to the ice and weather, meaning Washington attacked with less than his full planned force and still won. Any one of half a dozen variables going slightly differently and the operation falls apart. The pattern was becoming clear. Washington planned. Washington acted with genuine boldness, and the universe, or providence, depending on your perspective, kept bailing him out at critical moments. The question of whether this makes him a genius or a lucky man is starting to seem less interesting than a different question entirely. Does it matter? If a commander consistently puts himself in positions where luck can save him, consistently makes the bold choice that luck rewards, consistently survives catastrophes that would have finished a less determined man, at what point does the willingness to keep rolling the dice become a form of genius in itself? The winter of 1777 to 1778 and Valley Forge is where Washington's story reaches its deepest and most revealing point. The Continental Army marched into Valley Forge in December of 1777 after a brutal campaign season that had seen the British capture Philadelphia, the American capital, the largest city in the colonies. Washington had lost the Battle of Brandywine in September, lost the Battle of Germantown in October, a battle where his own tactical plan was actually quite clever, but fell apart due to fog, friendly fire confusion, and poor coordination. Lost the capital. And now he was digging in for winter in a wind-swept plateau 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia with an army that was literally dying. The numbers at Valley Forge are staggering. Somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 soldiers died there over that winter, not in battle, but from cold, starvation, and disease. Men were barefoot in the snow. They were reduced to eating what they called fire cake, flour and water baked on hot stones. They lacked blankets. Smallpox tore through the camp. The supply system had essentially collapsed due to a combination of congressional incompetence, contractor corruption, and the genuine difficulty of provisioning an army in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter. Washington wrote letters to Congress that border on despair. In one famous letter, he warned that unless supplies arrived, the army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. And he was not exaggerating. What kept Washington going through Valley Forge? This is not a trivial question. By any rational calculation, the situation was hopeless. The British were comfortable in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress had fled to York, Pennsylvania, and was embroiled in political quarrels. Washington's own officers were beginning to question his leadership. There was a real political movement, history calls it the Conway Cabal, to replace Washington as commander with General Horatio Gates, who had won the stunning victory at Saratoga in October of 1777, capturing an entire British army. Gates had his supporters. Washington had his enemies. The winter of 1778 was the moment when Washington could most plausibly have been removed from command, and the revolution might have taken an entirely different course. The Conway Cabal deserves more attention than it usually gets because it reveals something crucial about Washington that goes beyond battlefield performance. General Thomas Conway, an Irish-born French officer serving in the Continental Army, wrote a letter to Gates that included disparaging remarks about Washington's leadership. The letter was somehow shown to Washington. The exact circumstances are disputed and a little murky, and Washington's response was ice-cold and surgically precise. He did not explode publicly. He did not fire Conway on the spot. He wrote a single, devastating letter to Conway that made clear he knew exactly what was being said about him. He worked quietly through allies in Congress to undermine the movement against him. He waited. And the cabal collapsed from its own internal contradictions, from Gates's inability to sustain political alliances, from the simple fact that Washington's personal reputation with the rank-and-file soldiers and with key congressmen was simply too strong to overcome. This is the Washington that the battlefield stories miss. The political operator, the man who understood power not just as something wielded with a sword, but as something built through relationships, trust, and reputation. He had been building that reputation for 20 years by the time he commanded the Continental Army. He knew how to appear humble while advancing his interests. He knew how to lose battles without losing his position. He knew how to make his survival seem synonymous with the survival of the revolution itself. And, to a remarkable extent, he made that identification real. By the spring of 1778, when Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and began transforming the Continental Army into a genuine fighting force, it was Washington's army, built in his image, loyal to him personally in a way that was remarkable for what was ostensibly a citizen army of a republic. Von Steuben is one of the great unsung heroes of the American Revolution, and understanding his contribution helps clarify exactly what kind of commander Washington actually was. Von Steuben arrived from Prussia, claiming to be a lieutenant general. He was actually a captain, but bringing something the Continental Army desperately needed: knowledge of how to train soldiers systematically. He did not speak English. He drilled troops in French and had his curses translated into English by aides, which the soldiers apparently found both educational and deeply entertaining. He personally demonstrated musket drills. He developed an American version of Prussian training methods adapted to the realities of the Continental Army, and within weeks, the change was visible. The men at Valley Forge came out of that winter broken physically, but transformed militarily. Washington recognized von Steuben's value immediately and gave him the authority he needed. That is actually a form of genius. Not the genius of tactical innovation, but the genius of recognizing talent and getting out of its way. Washington consistently surrounded himself with capable men. Knox with the artillery, Greene with logistics and operations, Alexander Hamilton as an administrative aide of extraordinary intelligence and energy, Lafayette bringing French enthusiasm and political connections. He was not threatened by their abilities. He used them. And when they made mistakes, he was often more patient with them than he was with himself. This habit of delegation, of building a team and trusting it, was fundamental to how the Continental Army survived its darkest years. The French alliance that formally came into effect in the spring of 1778 changed everything. Benjamin Franklin had been working in Paris for more than a year, charming the French court, exploiting the news of Saratoga, and slowly pulling France toward an open commitment to the American cause. When France officially declared its support, the calculation of the entire war shifted. Suddenly Britain had to worry about the Caribbean, about India, about a French invasion of the British Isles itself. Suddenly American ships had the support of the French Navy. Suddenly there were French troops, French money, French supplies. The British could no longer concentrate everything on crushing the rebellion in North America, and Washington, who had spent 3 years fighting a holding action, keeping the army alive against all odds, waiting for exactly this kind of shift, was suddenly in a very different position. Did Washington's strategy cause the French alliance? Not directly. Franklin made the alliance happen through diplomacy. The victory at Saratoga, won by Gates and Benedict Arnold, not Washington, was the specific event that convinced Louis XVI that backing the Americans was worth the risk. Washington's part was more indirect, but arguably more important. He had kept the army alive. He had kept the rebellion credible. He had prevented the British from achieving the decisive knockout blow that would have made the whole question of French intervention moot. Without Washington's stubborn refusal to let the Continental Army die, there would have been nothing for France to ally with. The army that limped out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was the foundation on which everything else was built. The Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778 is one of the most vivid moments of Washington, the man, as opposed to Washington, the statue. The British were evacuating Philadelphia and marching across New Jersey toward New York. Washington pursued. General Charles Lee commanded the advance force with orders to attack the British rear. Lee attacked. The British counterattacked with unexpected ferocity, and Lee ordered a retreat that threatened to become a rout. Washington rode forward and encountered the retreating troops, encountered Lee himself, and by multiple accounts exploded with a fury that stunned everyone present. He cursed at Lee, in public, in front of the troops. Washington, who was normally so controlled, so measured, so careful of his dignity, Washington apparently let loose a string of profanity that left witnesses speechless. He relieved Lee of command on the spot. He rode to the front, personally rallied the troops, held the line until the end of the day, and fought the British to something close to a draw. He could not break the British column. They slipped away in the night and made it to New York. Monmouth was not a decisive American victory by any measure, but it demonstrated something that mattered enormously for morale. The Continental Army trained at Valley Forge by von Steuben held the field against the finest British troops in the world. They did not run. They stood, fired disciplined volleys, and conducted a fighting retreat when necessary that bore no resemblance to the panicked flight of Long Island 2 years earlier. The army had been transformed, and Washington had transformed it, not through tactical brilliance, but through will, through the sheer refusal to accept that it could not be done. The years from 1778 to 1781 were a grinding, frustrating war of attrition that the history books sometimes compress into a few pages, but that felt, to the people living through it, like an eternity without a clear end in sight. The British shifted their strategy to the south, and it initially worked brilliantly. They captured Savannah, they captured Charleston, the worst American defeat of the entire war, with 5,500 soldiers surrendering at once, including 4 generals. They smashed Gates's army at Camden in August of 1780, reducing Gates to a humiliated fugitive who fled 200 miles from the battlefield before stopping. The South seemed to be falling back into British hands. Washington, far away in the north, could do relatively little except send Nathanael Greene south to try to salvage the situation. Greene's campaign in the South is a masterpiece of unconventional warfare that deserves its own separate discussion. But for our purposes, the critical point is this: Washington sent Greene. Washington trusted Greene with enormous independence of command. Washington resisted the temptation to micromanage a distant theater of operations. And Greene, working with partisan commanders like Daniel Morgan and Francis Marion, gradually wore the British Southern Army down through a series of battles where the Americans often lost tactically, but won strategically, forcing the British to expend irreplaceable men in victory after victory that left them weaker after each triumph. This is the kind of war Washington understood instinctively, because it was the kind of war he had been fighting for 6 years. You do not have to destroy the enemy's army, you just have to outlast it. By the summer of 1781, the situation had reached its decisive moment, and what happened next requires you to understand something about how military genius and luck interact at the highest level of history. Washington had been planning a major operation against New York for months. The French army, under Rochambeau, had joined him in the north. The two commanders had been coordinating, arguing sometimes, but working toward a combined operation. Washington was fixed on New York. Rochambeau thought Yorktown in Virginia, where Lord Cornwallis had established a position with his British army, was the better target. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was operating in the Caribbean and could potentially support either operation. De Grasse sent word in August that he was coming to the Chesapeake, not to New York. He was bringing 28 ships of the line and 3,000 soldiers. The window was narrow. He could not stay indefinitely in American waters. Washington had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. He pivoted, completely and instantly. The man who had been planning the New York operation for months abandoned it, turned the entire Allied force south, and began the march to Yorktown, conducting the movement with enough deception that the British in New York did not realize what was happening until it was too late. It was a masterpiece of operational flexibility, and it was made possible by French naval power, by Rochambeau's persistence, by de Grasse's boldness, and by a timing that no one fully controlled. The Battle of the Chesapeake Capes, fought on September 5, 1781, is arguably the most important naval battle in American history, and most Americans have never heard of it. A British fleet under Admiral Graves came down from New York to challenge de Grasse. The two fleets fought an inconclusive engagement. Tactically, it was almost a draw, but de Grasse held the Chesapeake. The British fleet withdrew to New York. Cornwallis was cut off. He had no naval relief, no escape route, no prospect of reinforcement. Washington's army arrived outside Yorktown and began the formal siege. 6 weeks later, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army of 8,000 men, the largest British force remaining in North America. His representative handed his sword to an American officer because Cornwallis claimed he was too ill to attend in person. The British band reportedly played a tune called The world turned upside down. They were not wrong. So, genius or lucky? Here is where we land after 8 years of war, dozens of battles, 2 near total destructions of the Continental Army, a political conspiracy against his command, a French alliance he did not create, a naval battle he did not fight, and a final victory that required the perfect coordination of forces he did not fully control. Here is the honest answer that most history books dance around. Washington was neither a tactical genius nor a man who simply got lucky. He was something rarer and more interesting than either. He was a man who understood what he was fighting for with absolute clarity. He was a man who never confused the survival of his army with the survival of his ego. He lost battles and kept the army alive. He lost battles and kept his command. He lost battles and kept the faith of the men who served under him. His genius was not Napoleon's genius, the lightning strike, the annihilating maneuver, the battle that decides everything in an afternoon. His genius was the genius of endurance, of choosing every single time to still be there tomorrow, to make the enemy fight another day and another after that, until the cost of the war became greater than the prize of winning it. He understood that he was not just a military commander. He was the living symbol of the revolution. As long as Washington stood, the revolution stood. As long as he refused to accept defeat as final, the cause refused to accept it. His men felt this. His officers felt it. The Congress felt it. And eventually, the British felt it too. Not as a tactical reality, but as a psychological one. You could beat Washington and still not win the war. That combination of personal authority and strategic patience, sustained across 8 years of suffering and doubt and failure, is genuinely remarkable, regardless of how many times luck stepped in to help. Was he lucky? Absolutely. The fog at Long Island, the Hessians at Trenton, de Grasse at the Chesapeake. Howe's strange passivity at several critical moments. Take away any one of those variables, and the story ends very differently. But here is the uncomfortable truth about luck in history. Luck happens to everyone. Luck happened to the British too. They had lucky moments, fortuitous timing, unexpected advantages. The difference is what you do with it. Washington consistently put himself in positions where luck could matter. He made the crossing to Trenton possible. The fog was not his doing, but the decision to cross was. He maintained the alliance with France possible. The Chesapeake battle was not his victory, but keeping the army alive long enough for France to join was. He was the constant, while everything else was the variable. And that constancy, that unyielding, sometimes maddening, occasionally brilliant refusal to stop, is what turned a man who lost more battles than he won into the father of a nation. But before we wrap this up, there is one more dimension of Washington that deserves a moment. Because after Yorktown, after the war was essentially won, Washington did something that shocked the world as much as anything he did on the battlefield. In December of 1783, at the Maryland State House in Annapolis, George Washington stood before the Continental Congress and resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. He had won the war. He commanded the loyalty of the most powerful armed force on the continent. His officers had literally proposed making him king, a proposal Washington rejected with what appeared to be genuine disgust. He could have seized power. Every precedent in human history suggested that the man who wins a revolution becomes the ruler of the new state. Washington walked away. He went back to Mount Vernon and his tobacco fields. King George III, upon hearing that Washington had resigned rather than crowned himself, reportedly said that if true, Washington was the greatest man in the world. Was that genius? Or was it something else entirely? A kind of moral clarity that transcends the genius luck question altogether. A man who spends 8 years fighting for the idea that no man should have unchecked power, and then proves he means it by giving up the power he has earned. That is either the deepest form of political wisdom or the most authentic expression of principle that American history has ever produced. Maybe it is both. Washington's failures on the battlefield make him human. His survival through those failures makes him remarkable. His decision about what to do with the victory makes him, in the end, genuinely great. Not the marble statue, the real man. The one who lost and stumbled and got lucky and kept going. And then, when it was all over, did the one thing that nobody expected. He went home. So here is what you should take away from everything we have covered today. George Washington was not the invincible warrior hero of the paintings. He was a man who had fought necessity, and nearly lost everything twice in New York. He was a man whose army literally starved and froze at Valley Forge, while Congress argued about money. He was a man who needed French ships to win his final battle. He was also a man of extraordinary personal authority, of almost superhuman endurance, of real political and psychological genius. The line between genius and luck runs right through the middle of his story, and the honest answer is that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. And that ambiguity, that human messiness, is precisely what makes him so fascinating. He was not a god. He was a man who refused to lose, and that, in the end, was enough. Now the question is yours. After everything we have explored today, the defeats, the escapes, the political maneuvering, the extraordinary luck, the genuine moments of brilliance, how do you see him? Is Washington a military genius who happened to catch some lucky breaks? Or is he fundamentally a lucky man who had just enough talent to exploit the breaks he got? Or is there a third option that neither label fully captures? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, this is one of those questions where the debate never really ends, and we want to hear where you land. If this kind of deep dive into the real stories behind the American founding is what you are into, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to Cradle of Democracy and check out our other video on the Constitutional Convention, where we reveal the backroom deals and personal feuds that almost sank the entire American experiment before it even got started. History is never as simple as the statues make it look, and that is precisely what makes it worth exploring.